All right. So thank you so much, everyone, for staying with us since morning. So we had a great day. So thank you so much for supporting us with attendance throughout the sessions, plenaries, interviews, keynotes. So this is the last session for the day. Nevertheless, the topic is really important, which is around global digital opportunities. Will the cybersecurity lead or lag? And that's one of the questions that I think all of us, including the senior leadership, including the board members, are asking that given the contours of digitization that has changed in 2020, will cybersecurity really lead or it will lag? Essentially, what we are trying to answer here is whether cybersecurity will be the enabler of digitization or it will be a showstopper. So to answer this question and to really share his experience and knowledge, we have Mr. Bharat Iyer, who is the junior partner in McKinsey office, San Francisco office. He has 20 plus years of technology and cyber experience. And throughout his career, he has been leading engagements on largest cybersecurity providers and private equity firms, really helping them to understand the market, understand the products. Been helping CISOs, enterprise CISOs, to understand the investment prioritization and building cyber resilience. So, Bharat, thank you so much for your presentation, and I hand it over to you to take us forward.
Thank you, Nathan. Thank you for the opportunity to have this conversation with the audience today. There were 6 topics that I was hoping to sort of talk about over the course of the next sort of 30 odd minutes. Number one is, the impact of digitization on cybersecurity, connectivity in the cloud. These are a number of large macro themes that all of us have seen over the last couple of years, but especially so accelerating over the course of 2020. What does this mean for cybersecurity? So I'll touch upon that. Number 2, I'll talk about the types of attacks and what attackers are hoping to get out of these attacks and who these attackers are. And then, I'll paint a picture with a few numbers talking about the degree of impact that this has had on corporations across the world, and also about why this matters for chief executives as well as boards. This is increasingly a high priority topic, and no enterprise client that I've spoken to over the last, call it 12 to 24 months, dismisses cybersecurity as anything less than a top priority. And as we get started, more directly addressing, Sunit, your question about, is cybersecurity going to be an enabler or a bottleneck? We'll talk about, what that could look like and what the trade-offs are that companies are making actively to directly answer that question. And then lastly, I'll share a point of view on how organizations should think about cyber resiliency and the pragmatic trade-offs that need to be made as part of this journey. And, I'll try and talk for about 30 odd minutes. At the end of that, I would love to hear from the audience any questions you have. I would love to be able to respond to that. And Sunit has kindly agreed to moderate and channel your questions to me. So, and we can spend maybe 10-15 minutes once I'm done talking, addressing your questions. So without any further ado, let's actually jump in and get started. And excuse me if some of these materials are familiar to you or too basic, but I just wanted to be more comprehensive than less so that we get the context of the overall key messages that I wanted to convey. Now, if you look at the cyber ecosystem in terms of who's doing what and what the players are, this is a bit of a cartoon that I like showing, showing clients. This is there are quite a few actors at play at both sides of the divide, right? When it comes to the types of attackers, right, you have, on the one hand, insiders that actually orchestrate and help external attackers gain access to enterprise systems. And on the other hand, you have nation-state actors who are much more sophisticated, who use a wide-ranging tool set. And over the last week or so, we've seen significant breaches coming in from nation-state actors across key parts of the U.S. infrastructure. And lastly, maybe more innocuous, maybe not, is about competitors and other participants in the market in which a given company operates that are hoping to gain insight into into the company's internal system. And on the other side of the divide, trying to protect a given organization from all of these threats that are out there, you have what is on the front line, and then you have sort of what happens behind the scenes from an orchestration and support perspective. And all of these actors work together to help. In many cases it works, in many cases it does not work. But we as an industry are learning actively and adapting and coming up with pragmatic measures to be able to protect what truly matters. And I'll talk about what I mean by that. I mean, I'm being slightly vague, cognizant that I'm being slightly vague, but bear with me and it'll be clear what I mean by pragmatic measures. Now, skipping ahead, if you look at the impact of increasing digitization, faster and better connectivity, and the increasing adoption of cloud, what it really translates into is a manifold increase in the surface area for cybersecurity attackers to latch onto, right? So, traditionally you had your IT and OT systems, and that's now layered on by, well, in digitization we spoke about, but also cloud. But on top of that, you also have devices, IoT devices, that have exploded in, in number and complexity within a given organization. And all of these, you just need one sort of weakness for an attacker to gain some sort of access to a given enterprise network. And and the key message I want to convey is this is a trend that is broad and not one you can necessarily reverse, right? The choice is not to say, hey, listen, I'm going to minimize my surface area. You can think that, but that's not really a choice, because in order for you to do business in the modern connected world, in order to interact with customers, consumers, or B2B, in order for you to interact with suppliers, manufacturing partners, et cetera, your organization needs to be able to connect to a myriad of systems, and therefore surface areas are going to continue to increase, and that is much more of a given versus a choice that organizations end up making, right? So the implication of this, right, is that, largely that organizations don't really have a choice, number one. Number two, done wrong, we've seen much more recognition from industry about the implications, the financial implications. So, if you look at bucket number two, credit agencies have started downgrading organizations as a result. There is Equifax, right? As a result of that breach, Moody's downgraded the entire company, which again, prior to that was not something that was ever on the cards. And you also end up losing trust with consumers, right? We did a recent survey, this is probably about a year ago at this point, and what we found in that is most consumers are concerned about privacy online, and as a result of that, right, more than 70% of consumers have changed the way in which they would otherwise interact, and therefore this is much more of a lost opportunity. And if a given competitor of a company is able to figure out and build that trust with consumers, then that can mean that can have significant implications for the overall sort of growth trajectory of a given company. And lastly, regulators are taking note, right? There are regulatory requirements that are being imposed upon most companies in North America or anywhere in Europe, and therefore this is one where increasingly it's a top level priority. And we'll talk about the impact of what happens when a company takes it seriously versus not in just a bit. But the key message I want to leave you with is, one, increase in surface area. This is something that is that is the way, this is going to continue and not really change in terms of being more accessible to attackers. And if you don't do it right, there are significant implications across a number of dimensions. Therefore, it is a priority. Now, skipping ahead, right? If you talk about the types of attacks and who are these attackers, right? There's people out, attacks fall into largely two buckets, right? So one is specific targeted attacks. So, a given company being attacked for a specific purpose, and there's a number of avenues that adversaries use to attack organizations. And then you have much more of a, casting a broad and wide net to see what actually comes out there. And, over the last week or so, the attacks that we've seen, the successful attacks that have come to light, fall in, bucket number one, which is the targeted attacks. And these end up having for having far-reaching implications. I mean, as you read through this page, I mean, the key message I want to leave you with is, this is not just a technical problem where if you deploy the right cybersecurity tools or services, the problem is quote unquote solved. This requires a whole of organization approach to be able to build resiliency. And software tools can only do so much. They're essential, but they are one part of, or rather they are one building block that actually by in itself will not necessarily work. And the reason I say that, right, the reason this is increasingly important, and as I flip to the next page is, I guess the attack capability varies quite dramatically based upon who the adversary is. And it can be, on the one hand, on the one end of the spectrum, opportunists or insiders, and these are the, I guess, the least sophisticated when it comes to capability. On the other hand, you have state or business-sponsored entities that are much more sophisticated, leverage zero-day exploits, social engineering, spear phishing campaigns, et cetera, et cetera. And it, and therefore, it's not one attack vector that ends up succeeding, but a constant, but a concerted series of, I guess, strategies implemented over a long period of time, which actually ends up making them much more successful than not. So depending upon the, I guess, the risk profile of data and information that is there with a given organization, and who is likely to want to have access to that, the way in which a given organization thinks about how to protect it will need to vary, and that's the pragmatic choice that, again, I alluded to, and I'll talk more about talk more about shortly. Now, let me actually throw a few numbers out there so that you see how important this happens to be. I mean, this is a page that talks about specifically when it comes to healthcare, right? The kind of impact that that cybersecurity failures have had on companies. Now, the top row here illustrates the number of exposed consumer records, so PII across the U.S., and you'll see that over time, there's been almost an exponential increase in the number of records that have been leaked, and Kaiser Permanente, Genentech, these are large, major healthcare providers in the U.S., and 50,000 records lost because of a misplaced USB drive, right? Quite unfortunate. And similarly, if you look at the theme of this year, I mean, we as a firm have seen a significant uptake with our clients when it comes to ransomware attacks. And you'll see this in the press quite a bit as well. Again, the data shows that, again, this has also seen almost an exponential increase. And, there are estimates out there in terms of what this means in terms of the annual cost. And, the numbers are very large, right? I mean, without going into the specifics, and you can question the approach, but I think the net is the financial implications of cybersecurity failures is very significant when it comes to either the healthcare industry or pretty much any industry that you could possibly pick. Now, one sort of much more, if you talk about attack avenues or the way, we talked about the cloud for a second, and if you take misconfiguration of cloud deployments, here, this page lists out a number of examples, or well-known examples of data that has been exposed as a result of misconfiguration. I mean, it's a misnomer to think that it is purely as a result of an attack an organization ends up being compromised. One very real avenue is enterprise IT teams not really paying attention or having the tools or the discipline, and therefore, configuration not really being what it should be. AWS buckets, for example, end up being out there for anyone to access, and that's been a source of significant data loss for, as an illustrative example, the list of organizations here on this page here. So yes, it is about preventing attacks, but it's also about not keeping the front door open for anyone to come in and take what they want. Now, why does this matter, right? Or rather, what is the implication of getting it right? We did a piece of analysis a couple of years ago that talks about the share price performance of organizations after a significant cybersecurity breach as a result of the actions a management team has taken. And you'll see some significant deviations here on this page, right? The Equifax situation was could have been handled better, and as a result of which you see the way in which the share price has evolved. But at the same time, other organizations like Hampton, for example, they addressed the crisis quickly in a very transparent manner, and they were able to recover from that without any long-term damages. I mean, there's sort of legal challenges that they're still working through, but the market seems to have shrugged off the situation and moved on. Again, not the case with some other organizations, again, as I said, like Equifax and Target. So if you look at the incentives of the senior management team or a board, it is very much to, one, ensure that a material breach does not happen, number one. And number two, if it does end up happening, then the right response there truly, truly matters in terms of long-term value creation, preservation, etc. So, Sunita and I were discussing this earlier today, and one of the questions he was asking is, are organizations taking it seriously? Is this a strategic priority for CXOs? And the overwhelming answer is yes, of course, it is, and has been for some time. So I don't think that's a question that there's any gray area in directly addressing. Now, there's two real schools of thought about how to secure a given organization's sort of infrastructure, right? On the one hand, you can decide that, hey, listen, security is what truly matters, and I'd rather not have any avenue for a breach, at which point you can create, quote-unquote, military-grade security, where your strategy will be to minimize any and all risk, have very comprehensive monitoring, and put sort of the business need and the business aspiration as a second priority, and have protection as number one, right? So this is a situation where your consumer needs to jump through 15 different hoops to be able to log in and access a given service, versus versus a much more consumer-friendly approach of getting things done. And this is a choice that needs to be made, but at the same time, the choice truly is obvious based upon, I guess, the clients that I work with, where the military style security only or security first and everything else being secondary to that is not really a practical or a workable option, simply because if you do that, then your competitor will find a better way of doing that, and therefore your customers will end up switching. So therefore, unless you are operating in an industry where a customer has absolutely no choice, this is not one that actually is practical or one that will truly work, right? So, which brings us to sort of the next question about, so what do we do, right? What is the right approach? And I want to show a relatively busy page to you here. And, maybe I'll take a couple of minutes, for you to read through this. But organizations go through a number of S curves. I mean, there's four major S curves we've illustrated here, but I think there's a fifth one, which is, where cybersecurity ends up being a bit of a control function, where organizations, initially start off with security not really being a concern, right? And this was probably the case maybe 15 years ago, or maybe even before that. And then, once organizations decide, oh, okay, we actually need to have, some sort of thought processes, some degree of investment when it comes to cybersecurity, they end up thinking about, okay, great, we need to have firewalls, we need to have VPNs, the very basics. So we need to have, cybersecurity ends up being much more of a control functions, check the box, we have these elements in place to protect us. Then over time, organizations end up realizing, that really doesn't work. And therefore, the approach needs to evolve to much more of a maturity-based approach, where cyber capability becomes much more important. Where it's not about, did you pick a firewall from vendor A or vendor B? I mean, that becomes much less of a concern, but it's more, much less of a concern. And most organizations today, globally, right, end up being in this bucket today. Now, and therefore we call, we're bucketing this into foundational capability, with a foundational sort of cybersecurity capability. The more advanced organizations out there have actually evolved into thinking more about risk, right? And what that means is to take a much more pragmatic view and say, I know that I cannot protect every enterprise resource or every sort of enterprise source, every database to the nth degree, right? So my approach will be practical. I will figure out what is truly important to me, in a sense, what are my quote unquote crown jewels, and I will then I will put in place safeguards to minimize the enterprise risk to my organization, right? Enterprise-wide risk, and I will channel investments to mirror what those enterprise priorities end up being. So this is where the conversation ends up much more in the boardroom, where the risk function within a board, the audit function, the risk function, takes a view on, great, here's what we think is the right risk appetite that we as the organization have. And then, the CIO and CISO end up being tasked with putting in place programs over many years to evolve the organization's maturity from wherever it happens to be to whatever the expectations or other, the expectations that have been set by the board. And this is where, again, it becomes a much more important and a material part of what a board sort of thinks about. And then at the very end, you have sort of, holistic. There are very few organizations that have reached this and are truly able to do this. There are a few, and these happen to be truly standout within the industries they operate in. And again, maybe I'll skip over that because that's not the bulk of what's actually happening out there. Now,
Bharat, I have a question here, if I can. Yeah. So Bharat, so here, like I see that most of the companies are in the bucket of maturity-based approach, and where I see a lot of emphasis given on the software solutions or tool side of it. But in the beginning, in one of the slides, you said in order to get to the risk-based approach or maybe the proactive approach, probably the best way is to have all organization approach, as in thinking from various aspects that organization can offer, not just the software side of it. Now, one of the ways that you described here is the sort of identify the crown jewel and then make the investments accordingly. So that is one part of the answer. But when I go back to what you said, is bring in all aspects of the organization. What all other aspects of organization can really companies think about? So can you give some examples?
One very obvious one is people, right? So individuals like you and me. So phishing training needs to be a part of every organization's sort of approach to communicating the fact that their employees need to be aware that cybersecurity concerns are real. They need to be trained on how to identify malicious emails that we receive. And that's an ongoing process that needs to be put in place. So even if you have the most secure systems, your weakest point can end up being your rank and file employee. And you need to co-opt and solicit their support and their vigilance to ensure that the program is successful and works. Right? So one of the dimensions of maturity in what I talked about is people. Does that make sense and address your question? Okay.
Yes, it does.
Okay. So, the next page, that I'll go to, gives you a bit of an illustrative example of what this could look like, right? So, on the left, the picture talks about, and Sunil, this is something that talks to your question, is you have people, you have infrastructure, you have data, right? You have applications, blah, blah, blah. And then you have layers of protection protection around that core. Now, one approach is to say, hey, or rather, if you look at the S curve, the approach towards the very left is I will provide equal protection, around each of these elements, and therefore, that's one way of achieving a certain degree of resilience. Now, what we suggest that organizations do is actually go in and say, hey, listen, yes, that's what we have right now, but map what actually those practices mean when it comes to enterprise risk, and create real data about and metrics about what the existing way of protecting a given organization means when it comes to enterprise risk, and map that over time. So you can say, hey, listen, today we score X, and we want to implement these programs to be able to improve our risk, our risk levels. And then 3 years down the line, you can go in there and revisit and look at those numbers and have very clear articulation of how the needle has been moved, right? So step one is to gather the information and create a baseline to understand where things are, right? Then, right, once you figure that out, you understand where you're weak. Then it's actually about thinking about how and where to deploy capital, right? So the traditional approach, again, is similar structure with the previous pages. I will deploy equal amounts of capital regardless of what the underlying asset that I'm trying to protect. But then the risk-based approach that I've been talking about is saying, hey, listen, the areas where I have the most risk, right? Maybe it's people, maybe it's some data, maybe it's all data, right? Whatever, once you identify what that is, over-investing or investing appropriately in those high-risk areas to rebalance how capital is deployed to ensure that overall, as an organization, your risk level is reduced at a much more sort of practical spend level, right? As organizations move up the maturity curve, this is what they end up adopting. So the conversation, ends up being, what is important from an organizational resiliency point of view, and what is the right degree of protection given that importance? Let me pause there and see if the audience has any questions. I mean, I know I talked fast and went through quite a few pages, but happy to go back and share any additional insight color. Please.
Sure. So if he has a question, please use the public chat functionality to type your question, and I'll take that up. There is no. Maybe we'll just give 1 more minute.
Yep.
If you have any question, please use public chat functionality on the left side of the console. No, there are no questions. So, yeah, I think this message is very loud and clear that we need to take a risk-based approach rather than just focusing on 1 or 2 aspects of the organization, right? And people is as important as the technology, like you pointed out, and that's the key message, at least, that I am taking with me. The second is the golden question that is cybersecurity lead or will cybersecurity lag, enabler versus the bottleneck. I think we have a clear-cut answer from you, which is that it really is an enabler, but then there is a particular way in which organizations should learn to adopt various cybersecurity measures in order to not just be secure, but really be resilient, have those practices incorporated. So I think those are the 2 key messages that at least I'm taking from this presentation. Bharat, it was great to have you, and I think your presentation was really crisp and it delivered right spot on. So thank you so much for that. And yeah, so any closing comments, Bharat, from you?
No, thank you for having me. Pleasure, and good luck, everyone.
Thank you. So for the audience, we have day 2 tomorrow and day 3 after. We have interesting lineups of speakers. Please do visit our agenda corner, and I'm looking forward to have you there. So thank you so much, everyone. Merry Christmas if we don't meet again, and Happy New Year in advance. Thank you so much. Bye.